Unfortunately, accidents happen in any sport, and one of the most common accidents that happens in hunting situations involves shotguns. And I'll tell you a story after you see the footage involving the destruction of a 12 gauge pump action shotgun. But I have to explain to you in the first place that what you're about to see was conducted in controlled circumstances. Don't try to do anything of what you're about to see at home. I don't want to sound overly dramatic, but I have to caution you because the shotgun is destroyed, not this shotgun, and I'll explain to you the context and then we'll go to the footage. What we have here is a 20 gauge shotgun shell and a 12 gauge shotgun shell. Some people were writing me asking me about gauges. Well, the higher the number, the smaller the shell. Anyway, getting to the point, the 20 gauge shell will easily fit into the 12 gauge. It'll fall through the chamber and it'll lodge in the barrel right about here. This area is called the forcing cone of the barrel, and if somebody drops that 20 gauge shell into the chamber and doesn't mention it, and it sounds impossible to happen, but it happens all the time. This is a fairly common accident. Then the next person, or maybe it's you drop the 12 gauge shell in thinking that the 20 gauge shell, which was in your pocket, fell into the swamp or fell into the mud, or you can't account for it. Hunting by definition is pretty exciting. Anyway, I'll show you where these shells end up. So the 20 gauge shell sits about here in the barrel, and the 12 gauge shell sits about here. So you can't see the 20 gauge shell. Now, if you're shooting a single shot or a double, you can see the shell, but a pump action or a semi, you're likely not going to notice it. And when you fire the 12 gauge shell, surprising things happen. Anyway, I'll state again, don't try this at home. I've seen other tests where this was attempted, but the outcome of this experiment, I think, is quite surprising. So once again, don't do this at home. Don't try it at all. And we'll look now at the footage of what happened in our homemade laboratory. Now you've had a chance to see the destruction of a shotgun, and I'll give you a bit of the backstory, if that's the right terminology. A long time ago I was hunting with a 20 gauge single shot shotgun on the shores of a freshwater lake, which was part of a freshwater marsh complex, and I actually had just shot a duck and then ran into an old gentleman who was hunting with an 1897 shotgun, and at that time I didn't know shotguns all that well, but I well remember the hammer on his shotgun, and it was a pump action. Anyway, I was using this 20 gauge single shot, and he looked at me, and we were talking about the duck I had in hand, and he said, "You have to be careful with the 20 gauge. Are you hunting with anybody?" And I answered, and he said, "Make sure that you don't put your 20 gauge shell into their 12 gauge shotguns." And I said, "Oh, why is that?" And he said, "Well, your 20 gauge will get stuck in the 12 gauge barrel, and it can be hard to get it out, and if you don't get it out, and if somebody forgets about it, there can be an accident." And I still remember he said that his dad had that accident, and his face was torn from cheek to jowl. I don't know, I would have to Google that to figure out what that means, but it sounded like a bad accident. And naturally, I only had 20 gauge shotgun shells, and I didn't say any more because he was so much my senior, and I was just kind of, you respect people like that. And but I always kept it in mind. And then over time, different things happened, and I heard about accidents, and sometimes in the local paper there was some story about an accident, and I always wondered about this 20 gauge getting stuck in a 12 gauge barrel. So I tried to recreate that, and I used the shotgun that you've just seen destroyed is this shotgun here. This is not an expensive shotgun, and the stock was broken. It worked fine. It had to work fine in order for the experiment to take place. And I said this at the beginning of the video, but I'll say it again. Don't try this, because the results were catastrophic and far worse than I expected. And now I understand why that gentleman told me that his dad's face was torn open, which didn't mean much to me at the time, except that it's not a good thing. And his caution worked. I was always careful. In fact, I just never hunted with a 20 gauge again when there were people with a 12 gauge around. So here we have this shotgun. It's a Noble shotgun. Now, we kind of rehearsed this. So the camera people told me that they can film the distortion of the action. And this is an excellent shotgun. This is hardened steel. It's a Noble shotgun. That's the maker's name. And I mean, this is not a Winchester Model 12, but it doesn't matter. This is all hardened steel. You can see it has a brass trigger guard. Here's the lifter. But as you watched in the video, there's a moment when the action fails, which is totally unexpected to me. This outcome I never thought would happen. I thought the barrel would burst, because there's nowhere for the 12 gauge shot and powder and wads and pressure to go. But as you can see, the barrel stayed intact. Instead, the bolt blew back, and in the video, I encourage you to watch it more times, and I'm sorry I don't have a high-speed camera, but the bolt actually, the locking mechanism failed, and the bolt flew out the back of the action and blew out the stock. Now this is deceiving here. This was a repaired stock. That's why I decided I would sacrifice this shotgun, but I thought I would be sacrificing the barrel. But this is how the old timer was open from cheek to jowl. This bolt came back, and I had sandbags. You may not see it in the video that shows this shotgun failing, but it was as tightly controlled as I could make it in scientific method, which sounds fancy, but anyway, I had the barrel in a plastic sand trap, and that's why I had to cut off the barrel. So I really was serious about figuring out how dangerous this is. And if you're lucky, the 20 gauge shell stuck in the forcing cone here will fly out the barrel. If you're unlucky and the pressure works another way, then the locking lug fails, as it did with this one, and the bolt flies back into your face, which is a terrible accident at the least. I'm sure somebody's been killed, but I can tell you what happened. This flew out the back of the action after the stock failed, and I think this stock would have failed as badly or worse even if it had not been repaired. You can even see some of the epoxy from the original repair, but epoxy is strong. Sometimes people tell me it's fixed and it could break again, but it won't break here. May or may not be true. This flew out the back of the bolt. The bolt flew out the back of the action. The bolt flew through the sandbag that I had that was weighting down the back of the stock. The action completely distorted here. But this still is kind of a mystery to me, and it's just a lesson in pressure. The pressures had to be so catastrophic. Here's the primer indent when we pulled the trigger with the string. This is the shell. This is an identical shell as I loaded behind the 20 gauge. There's the primer indent. Here's the 20 gauge. Take a look at this. It's completely distorted, but the primer didn't go off. Yet I believe that this 20 gauge shell did fire. even though the primer didn't go off, from the looks of it, from the powder burns and from this distortion to the brass, I think this 20 gauge shell went off. It didn't travel down the barrel, which is the lucky outcome. Maybe it's a tighter barrel, maybe it's a tighter forcing cone, I don't know. The debris field was all over the place, and on the floor, different parts and components of the shotgun. But I find these the most interesting, and I guess this is also from, and here's another piece of the stock. Everything was all over the place. And here's the cool thing, and this is, you know, this is an example of when pressures get high, it's very difficult to determine, and I don't even pretend to understand what happened with this shotgun, but something went so wrong and the pressure was so high to cause the bolt to fail and fly out the back of the gun. That's significant. Anyhow, take a look at this. Here's the 12 gauge shell. And some of you experts out there probably have a better idea of what happened than I have. But there's sort of an area of explosives that deals with shaped charges, which I don't pretend to fully understand. But something happened when that 12 gauge shell went off. The 20 gauge shell also went off. But the 20 gauge shell didn't go down the barrel. It's actually stuck in the barrel. This part of the 20 gauge shell, this yellow part, that's sitting here in the barrel. I actually can't account for that. But getting back to what did happen, you can see in the footage, after this is over, these pieces, the cartridge base, the 20 gauge cartridge base and the 12 gauge are sitting in here. And the 20 gauge shell blew through the 12 gauge shell. Everything went backwards, which is really weird to me. But pressure has to go in the path of least resistance. So I guess if the 20 gauge case had separated from the 20 gauge shell and got stuck in the barrel, then maybe it could only go backwards. And I mean, this steel here is no joke, and yet it's completely bent and distorted. And the lifter is completely stuck, and the brass trigger guard is bent, and there's nothing I can do with it. I'm not even sure the bolt is complete, because there are pieces of metal on the floor that I haven't collected. But it would be useless to collect them because they're just little shards of things. Anyway, so obviously this was catastrophic pressure. There's also pieces of the, we probably, my filming is so primitive, but anyway, there are pieces of shells, of the shell casing in here. That's the hammer back here. It still moves. The hammer still moves. So that means the hammer flew forward, hit the firing pin, fired the shell, then the whole bolt failed, flew out the back of the action, destroyed the stock, would have destroyed the face of the shooter or killed him. And then the hammer came back forward, I don't know, because I guess the sear broke off. I haven't taken this apart because I wanted to show you, what I have. Also, the slide is finished because it's not attached to the bolt or anything. So, contrary to a few other stories I've heard, and some I've seen, where there's a happy ending and the 20 gauge shell just goes out the forcing cone, whatever circumstances prevailed here are the ones that once in a while claim a life. So I guess the conclusion is, to me anyway, if somebody has a 20 gauge in the hunting party, maybe it's a good idea that they switch to a 12 or switch to something else, because if that gets stuck in there, and no one intends to do these things, but they happen anyway, and you can see from the debris the amount of pressure. I can't account for how the 20 gauge primer didn't fire or how the 20 gauge shell fired, but it did as far as I can tell. There's a 20 gauge shell body stuck in barrel. Anyway, I'll take it down more, I guess. I don't know how I'm going to get it out of there. but I'm sure I will. So anyway, I guess ultimately we all want to save lives and prevent accidents, and this was completely shocking. The amount of destruction was unexpected, and the pressures must have been phenomenal to cause this kind of damage. And there's not that much pressure in shotgun shells, as most of you know. Anyhow, I hope that's useful, and please be careful out there when it comes to 20 gauge shells and 12 gauge shells. That 20 will sit in the forcing cone, and unlike what other experiments that you might see, sometimes this happens, which means just don't let it happen at all. For those of you that are wondering, is there distortion in the barrel? There is some distortion. It's obviously been exposed to high pressure, but it didn't fail. The bolt failed first. So it's too bad that the bolt failed first, because it would have been better if something had happened in here, which is, if you look at my camera setup in the lab, I was expecting this to rupture, but that's not what happened. And I guess that's how that guy's dad was so badly injured. So anyway, a different video. I thought I learned a lot. I'm not sure what I learned, because high pressure is difficult to actually understand exactly what unfolded. And again, my frame rate was too low to capture the whole thing. But still interesting, and thank you very much for watching. And maybe one day I'll repeat it, but it was pretty hairy in the lab, so maybe I won't. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time.